Tonight, Gene Wilder is sitting across from Johnny Carson, and the interview is going exactly the way everyone expected. Warm, witty, effortlessly charming. And then Johnny asks one question he was never supposed to ask. One question that nobody on the production team had cleared, that Gene Wilder had never been asked in 11 years of Hollywood interviews. And what Gene does next, what he says, what he pulls from his jacket pocket, what he admits on camera to 22 million strangers, will make Johnny Carson go so still, so completely motionless, that the director in the control room will think something has gone wrong with the feed. But the feed is fine. Johnny Carson is fine. He is just hearing for the first time the real story behind the most famous scene Gene Wilder ever performed. And it has nothing to do with acting. Before we go further, I want to say something directly to you. I see comments every week from people who are shocked to discover they were never subscribed to this channel. If you have been watching these stories, if they have moved you even once, please take 10 seconds right now to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, it changes nothing about your day, and it means everything to what we are building here together. Thank you for being part of this. Now, September 1982, NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The Tonight Show is taping at its usual hour. The guest list for the evening includes a comedian, a musician, and Gene Wilder, booked third, slotted for a comfortable 12 minutes there to talk about his new film. The producers have the questions approved. The segment is mapped. Everything is under control, except for one thing that nobody in that building knows yet. Gene Wilder arrived at the studio 3 hours early. Not 2 hours, not 90 minutes, 3 hours. He sat alone in the green room with a cup of tea he did not touch, turning something over and over in the pocket of his jacket. Something small, something folded, something he had been carrying for 11 years without telling a single person why. What was it? That is the question that will change everything tonight. But first, you need to understand who Gene Wilder really was, because the man the world thought it knew, the wild-eyed comedian with the curly hair and the exploding laughter, was only half the picture. The other half had never been shown to anyone, not to Hollywood, not to the press, not even in many ways to himself. Jerome Silberman was born on June 11, 1933, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His mother was beautiful and warm and very sick. She had rheumatic fever that damaged her heart, and the doctors told his father early on that stress could kill her, that joy even could kill her, that any strong emotion might be the one that tipped her heart into failure. Jerome was 8 years old when he learned this. 8 years old when his father sat him down and explained, gently and carefully, that Jerome needed to be funny, that making his mother laugh, carefully, gently, in small doses that kept her spirits lifted without overwhelming her fragile heart, was not just a kindness. It was a medical necessity. It was the thing that might keep her alive. Think about what that does to a child. Think about what it means to be 8 years old and told that your job, your actual responsibility, is to perform joy, to manufacture it, to deliver it on schedule and in the correct emotional dosage to the one person you love most in the world. Jerome Silberman learned to be funny the way other children learn to walk, out of necessity, out of love, out of a fear so large and so quiet that it never made a sound. His mother died when he was 23. She had lived 15 more years than the doctors predicted. Jerome always believed he knew why. He changed his name to Gene Wilder when he started acting. Jerome Silberman disappeared, and in his place came someone louder, wilder, more electric. A man who could fill a room with something that felt like chaos but was, if you watched closely, always perfectly controlled, always calibrated, always performing joy at exactly the right intensity to keep the people around him comfortable. But here is what nobody knew. Here is the detail that changes everything. The scene in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory that everyone remembers. The scene where Wonka suddenly turns on Charlie, his voice dropping from warmth into something cold and cutting, his face transforming in an instant from gentle eccentricity into genuine fury. That scene was not in the script, not in any version of the script, not in Roald Dahl's original draft, not in David Seltzer's screenplay, not in any revision or production note or table read. That scene existed nowhere except inside Gene Wilder's head, and he fought for it alone, against the director, against the studio, against everyone who told him it was wrong for the character, wrong for the film, wrong for a children's movie that was supposed to be about wonder and sweetness and the magic of imagination. Gene Wilder told them, "If I cannot play that scene, I will not do the picture." They gave him the scene. And for 11 years, nobody asked him why. Nobody in 11 years of press junkets and talk show appearances and film retrospectives asked Gene Wilder the one question that mattered. Where did that scene come from? What were you actually doing in that moment? What were you expressing that had nothing to do with Willy Wonka and everything to do with something you had been carrying since you were 8 years old in Milwaukee, Wisconsin? Nobody asked. Until Johnny Carson. And even Johnny did not know he was asking it. Wait. Do not miss what is about to happen. Because the way this conversation begins is not the way it ends. Not even close. The taping begins at the usual hour. The first two guests move through their segments smoothly. Then Ed McMahon's voice fills the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, the star of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, of Blazing Saddles, of Young Frankenstein, please welcome Gene Wilder. The audience erupts with genuine warmth. Gene walks out from behind the curtain, and the first thing he does is something that delights the room. He trips on absolutely nothing, catches himself, looks back at the floor with an expression of profound personal betrayal, and the audience is already laughing before he has taken 3 steps toward the desk. He shakes Johnny's hand. He sits down. He crosses his legs and settles into the chair with the easy confidence of a man who has done this 100 times. The interview begins. Johnny asks about the new film. Gene is warm and funny and generous. The audience loves him. Everything is going exactly as planned. And then Johnny leans back slightly in his chair. It is a gesture the people who know him recognize, the slight backward tilt that means he is about to go off script, and he says something quiet and direct that nobody in the room was expecting. Gene, he says, that scene in Wonka, the one where you turn on Charlie, what was that really about? The studio does not go quiet immediately. It takes a few seconds, long enough for the audience to register that something in Gene Wilder's expression has changed. The warmth is still there. The ease is still there. But underneath it, something has shifted, the way ice shifts on a lake in early spring, invisible from a distance but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. Gene looks at Johnny for a long moment. Then he looks at the audience. Then he looks back at Johnny. How much time do we have? Gene asks. Johnny does not glance at the production desk. He does not check the clock. He looks directly at Gene Wilder and says, as much as you need. What happened next would run 18 minutes over the scheduled segment time. The producers would not cut to commercial once during that stretch. The director, a man named Bobby Quinn, who had been working The Tonight Show for 9 years, would say afterward that he called the control room at the 7-minute mark and told them simply, do not touch the feed. Just let it go. Gene reaches into the pocket of his jacket. He does it slowly, almost reluctantly, the way you reach for something you have been carrying so long that the act of finally taking it out feels irreversible. He sets it on the desk between himself and Johnny, a folded piece of paper, small, worn at the edges, the kind of worn that comes not from age but from handling, from being taken out and looked at and folded back up again more times than anyone could count. What is that? Johnny asks quietly. Gene looks at it for a moment before he answers. It is something my father wrote me, Gene says, the night before I left for New York to start acting school. I was 20. He was not a man who wrote letters. He was not a man who talked about feelings or fears or any of the things that were actually happening inside him. But that night, he sat down at the kitchen table and he wrote me something, 1 paragraph. And I have carried it in my wallet, and then in my desk drawer, and then in the pocket of whatever jacket I am wearing, for 32 years. The studio is very quiet now. He tells me, Gene continues, to be careful with the anger. Those were his exact words. He said, and I have read this so many times I could recite it in my sleep, he said. The anger is real, Jerome. It is part of you, and it has always been part of you. But you have spent your whole life learning to turn it into something else, into something people can receive without being frightened. Do not lose the anger. Do not pretend it is not there. But choose, always choose, what you make it into. Gene pauses. He is not performing anymore. The thing that has always separated Gene Wilder from other performers of his generation is that when the performance drops, something more interesting appears underneath. Not vulnerability for its own sake. Not the calculated emotional confession of a man working an audience. Just a person, sitting in a chair, telling the truth. My mother was sick my entire childhood, Gene says. I told Johnny this. I told him the whole story about the rheumatic fever, about my father sitting me down at 8 years old, about the instruction to be funny, to make her laugh carefully, just enough. He listened without interrupting. And when I finished, he said something that I did not expect. He said, you have been performing your whole life for an audience of 1. Gene looks at Johnny when he says this. Johnny does not react the way the audience expects. There is no smile, no quick pivot to the next question. He is sitting very still. His hands are flat on the desk. He is looking at Gene Wilder with an expression that the camera operator on the center crane, a man named Phil Dorado, who would work The Tonight Show for another decade, would later describe as the most unguarded he had ever seen Johnny Carson look on camera. Not sad, exactly. Not moved, exactly. Recognized. The expression of a person who has just heard something said aloud that they have thought privately for a very long time but never found the words for. But what you have seen so far is nothing compared to what Gene Wilder says next. Because Gene has not yet explained the scene. He has explained the childhood. He has explained the father's letter. He has explained the architecture of a man who learned to manufacture joy as a survival mechanism before he was old enough to understand what survival meant. But he has not yet told Johnny, has not yet told anyone, in 11 years what he was actually doing in that soundstage in Munich in the spring of 1970 when the cameras rolled and Willy Wonka turned on Charlie Bucket and said, in a voice that had nothing childlike in it, in a voice that cut through the sweetness of every other frame in that film like a blade, "You get nothing. You lose. Good day, sir." Gene leans forward slightly. His voice drops. "That scene," he says, "is about every person who was ever trusted with something precious and broke that trust anyway. Every person who was handed something real, real love, real faith, real belief, and treated it carelessly. Wonka gives Charlie everything. He opens the whole world to him. And the only condition is that Charlie not be corrupted by it, that he not let the adults around him talk him into betraying what he knows is right." Gene pauses. Charlie fails the test. And Wonka's rage, his absolute, cold, furious rage, is not cruelty. It is grief. It is the grief of a person who built something beautiful specifically for someone they believed in, and then watched that person let them down. He looks at Johnny. "I knew that feeling," Gene says quietly. "I had felt it my entire life. Every time I made someone laugh when I was terrified. Every time I turned the anger into something they could receive. Every time I performed joy I did not feel because the person in front of me needed it, and I did not know how to say, 'I am not fine. I am frightened. I need something too.' That scene was the first time in my professional life that I let the anger out without turning it into anything, without softening it, without making it palatable. I just let it be what it was." He picks up the folded paper from the desk. He holds it in both hands. "My father told me to choose what I make the anger into. For 30 years, I made it into comedy. I made it into characters who were frantic and brilliant and barely holding together. I made it into something audiences could love, but that one scene, 90 seconds of film, I made it into the truth. And the truth was, I was exhausted. I was 37 years old, and I had been performing for other people's comfort since I was 8. And for 90 seconds, in a chocolate factory set in Bavaria, I stopped. Johnny Carson is not moving. He has not moved in 4 minutes. The audience has not made a sound. Did it help?" Johnny asks. The question is so quiet the microphone barely catches it. Gene considers this for a long moment. "It helped me understand something," he says. "That the performance, all of it, the comedy, the timing, the wild eyes and the laughter, it was never dishonest. It was real. I really am that person. But it was also a door I had closed on something else. And for the rest of my career, after that scene, I always knew the door was there. I always knew I could open it if I needed to. That knowledge changed everything." He sets the folded paper back down on the desk. "I have never told that to anyone," he says simply. Johnny looks at the paper. Then he looks at Gene. "Can I ask you something else?" Gene nods. "Your father wrote that you had been learning your whole life to turn the anger into something people could receive. Do you think he knew, when he wrote that, what it had cost you?" Gene is quiet for a very long time. Long enough that the audience begins to understand this is not a pause for effect. This is a man searching for an honest answer to a question he has never been asked. "I think," Gene says finally, "that my father understood more than he ever said. I think he watched me perform joy for my mother for 15 years, and he knew exactly what it was doing to me, and he did not know how to give me permission to stop, because stopping might have hurt her, and hurting her might have killed her. So he watched me carry it, and he never said anything, and then I was leaving for New York, and he sat down and wrote one paragraph, and it was the closest he could come to saying, 'I see you. I have always seen you. I am sorry I could not tell you sooner.'" A sound moves through the studio. Not applause. Not quite. Something more like a breath released collectively by 300 people who have been holding it without realizing. Johnny reaches across the desk and places his hand briefly over Gene's. He does not say anything. He does not need to. The Tonight Show ran 22 minutes over its scheduled runtime that night. NBC logged over 14,000 calls to its viewer response line before midnight. The segment was replayed on 3 separate occasions over the following decade, each time generating a wave of letters, not from fans of Gene Wilder specifically, not from people writing about comedy or film, but from adults writing about their parents, about the performances they had given, about the anger they had turned into something else, about the door they had always known was there and never opened. Gene Wilder did not talk publicly about that conversation for many years afterward. He was asked about it repeatedly and deflected every time with the gracious, unhurried warmth that was his natural register in public. But in a 2005 interview conducted for a film journal, print only, no cameras, he was asked what he considered the most honest moment of his career. He did not mention Young Frankenstein. He did not mention Blazing Saddles, or the physical precision of his comedy, or the partnership with Mel Brooks that had defined a decade of American humor. He thought about the question for a moment, and then he said, "There was a night on The Tonight Show when Johnny Carson asked me where a scene came from, and I told him the truth. And the truth turned out to be a different story than the one I had been telling myself for 30 years. He paused. My father wrote me that the anger was real. He was right. But what he did not write, what I had to learn on my own, over 40 years, was that the love was real too. The performances I gave for my mother were not false. The joy I manufactured was not a lie. It was love expressed in the only language I had been taught. The comedy was real. The fury was real. Both things were true at the same time. And I think I finally understood that sitting across from Johnny Carson in 1982, holding a piece of paper my father wrote 32 years earlier. He folded the paper back up. I put it in my pocket. He said, and I walked out of that studio feeling lighter than I had in years. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992. In the years that followed, asked repeatedly about the interviews he considered most significant, he returned again and again to a handful of evenings, the nights when something unplanned happened, when the format dissolved and 2 people simply talked. Gene Wilder's name appeared on that list every time. Not because it was the most dramatic broadcast in the show's history, not because it reached the highest ratings or generated the most press, but because, as Johnny put it in one of his final interviews, Gene came in that night carrying something he had never shown anyone, and instead of keeping it in his pocket, he put it on the desk, and that took more courage than anything I ever saw on that stage. Gene Wilder passed away on August 29, 2016. He was 83 years old. Among his personal effects, his family found the folded piece of paper, still in the pocket of the last jacket he regularly wore. One paragraph, written in his father's handwriting, the edges worn soft from decades of handling. On the back, in Gene's own handwriting, added at some point in the years after that Tonight Show conversation, 4 words. I opened the door. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think about the performance you give every day, the version of yourself you have learned to present because someone needed it, because the room required it, because you were taught early that your job was to be the thing that held other people together. Think about the door. Think about what is on the other side of it. You do not have to open it for everyone, but you need to know it is there. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who has spent their life making other people comfortable at the cost of their own honesty. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because these stories are reaching people everywhere, and I want to know where the truth is landing. And if there is a scene in your life, a moment when you stopped performing and let something real come through, tell us about it in the comments. Tell us what it cost you. Tell us what it gave back. We are listening, we are here, and the door is always there if you need it. This video is presented by our amazing members who make everything on this channel possible without any sponsorship or advertising. If you would like to support the channel and get access to exclusive member-only episodes, click the join button below. It means more than you know. And before you go, if this story moved you, if it gave you something, please take 2 seconds and hit the like button. It tells us to keep going. It tells us the work matters, and it really genuinely does. There is one more thing about that September night in 1982 that has never been fully reported. After the taping ended, after the studio audience filed out and the crew began breaking down the set, Gene Wilder did not leave immediately. He sat in the guest chair for several minutes after the cameras went dark. A lighting technician named Raymond Castillo, who was working late that evening repositioning rigs for the following night's broadcast, noticed him still sitting there and hesitated, unsure whether to approach or give him space. Gene caught his eye and smiled. The full Gene Wilder smile, warm and genuine and slightly surprised at itself. Castillo said later that it was one of the most disarming things he had ever seen. A man who had just peeled back something enormous, sitting alone under the work lights with that smile, as if he were genuinely pleased to have been caught still sitting there. Raymond asked if he needed anything. Gene thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have children?" Raymond said he had a daughter. She was 4 years old. Gene nodded slowly. "Make her laugh," he said. "But also, and this is important, let her see you be serious. Let her see you be afraid. Let her see you be the full thing, not just the part that keeps her comfortable. She will carry whatever she sees. Make sure what she carries is the whole truth." Raymond Castillo told that story to a reporter in 2016 when Gene Wilder died. He said he had thought about it every single day for 34 years. He said he had raised his daughter on it. He said she was now 38 years old, and that she was by every measure the most emotionally honest person he had ever known. And that he believed, down to his bones, that it was because of what a man with wild curly hair and a folded piece of paper had told a lighting technician in an empty studio at 11 o'clock on a September night in 1982. The world knew Gene Wilder as the man who played Willy Wonka, as the man whose eyes could go from soft to electric in a single frame, as the man who made laughter feel like something urgent and alive. But the people who were in that studio, the crew, the camera operators, the technicians in the control room, they knew something else. They knew that the performance was real, that the joy was real, that the fury was real, that all of it came from the same place, the place his father had named in one paragraph written at a kitchen table in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1953. "The anger is real, Jerome. It is part of you, and it has always been part of you, but you have spent your whole life learning to turn it into something else. Do not lose the anger. Do not pretend it is not there, but choose, always choose, what you make it into." Gene Wilder spent 60 years choosing. He chose comedy. He chose honesty. He chose on one September night on The Tonight Show to open the door and let Johnny Carson and 22 million strangers see what was on the other side. What was on the other side was a boy from Milwaukee who had learned to be funny so his mother would not die, who had carried the anger for 60 years and made it, every single time, into something people could receive, who had played a chocolate factory owner losing his temper for 90 seconds on a soundstage in Bavaria and understood for the first time in his life what it felt like to just let the true thing be the true thing without making it into anything else at all. The door was always there. He opened it, and everything on the other side was real. What none of the reviews, none of the retrospectives, none of the career profiles ever captured about Gene Wilder was the specific texture of his silence. Every performer has a silence, the pause before the punchline, the beat before the emotion, the held breath that tells the audience something is coming. Gene's silence was different. It was the silence of a man who had learned, very early, to measure what he released, to calculate the dose, to feel the temperature of the room before giving it anything real. His father had taught him that without meaning to. His mother's fragile heart had taught him that without knowing it. The whole of his childhood had been one long lesson in the management of joy. How much to give, how fast to release it, how to read the person across from you and calibrate accordingly. The comedy that came from this was extraordinary. The best of Gene Wilder is always calibrated to within a millimeter of itself. The eyes that go wide at precisely the right moment. The voice that drops to a whisper and then explodes upward without warning. The physical stillness that precedes the storm. These things are not accidental. They are the product of a man who spent his first 8 years learning to read another person's capacity for joy and calibrate his output accordingly. It made him a performer of almost mechanical precision, wearing the costume of chaos. But it also meant that Gene Wilder had never, not once in his professional life, simply let go. Not entirely. Not without calibrating. Even the Wonka scene, the closest he ever came, was still a performance, still a choice. Still Gene Wilder deciding with full deliberate intention that this was the moment to drop the warmth and let something cold and real come through. What he told Johnny Carson that September night was not a confession. It was a translation. He was translating 60 years of calibrated performance into plain language for the first time. He was saying, here is the mechanism. Here is the engine under the hood. Here is the 8-year-old boy who was told his laughter could keep someone alive and who spent the rest of his life finding out what else it could do. Johnny Carson understood this in a way that perhaps no other interviewer could have, because Johnny had his own version. Not the same childhood, not the same wound, not the same source, but the same result. A man who had learned to perform warmth and ease and unflappable composure so thoroughly that the performance had become indistinguishable from the person. A man whose real face appeared, if it appeared at all, only in the gaps, only in the moments between questions when the camera caught something that was not quite the famous smile, only in the rare conversations, and this was one of them, when someone said something true enough to stop the machinery for a moment. Johnny did not talk about himself during that segment. He did not pivot to his own story. He just listened. And in the listening, he gave Gene Wilder something that the man had been waiting 30 years to receive without knowing he was waiting for it. The experience of being in a room with another person and having that person simply pay attention, not laugh, not redirect, not tell a story of their own. Just pay attention, fully and without agenda, to what was being said. Gene talked about this afterward, in the quiet years, in the conversations that found their way into print without cameras. He said that what he remembered most about that night was not what he said. He could reconstruct his own words without effort. He had been thinking them for 30 years. What he remembered was Johnny's face while he was saying them. The absolute stillness, the eyes that did not wander, the sense of a man who had set down every professional habit he possessed and was simply present. It is a rare thing, Gene said, to be heard by someone who is also performing, because Johnny was always performing, in the same way I was always performing. That was our survival. That was how both of us had learned to move through the world. But that night, for 18 minutes, neither of us was performing. We were just two men in chairs, and one of us was telling the truth, and the other one was listening, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The piece of paper went back into his pocket at the end of the conversation. It was still in his pocket when he died. His family found it folded and soft and worn through at the creases, the handwriting still legible in the places that mattered. One paragraph. His father's voice preserved in ink for 60 years, telling his son what was true about him and trusting him to do something worthy with the truth. But there is one more layer to this story. One more thing that has to be said before the full picture comes into focus. And it concerns not Gene Wilder, not Johnny Carson, but the film itself, the one that started everything. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was not a hit when it was released. Not immediately. The studio was uncertain about it. The reviews were mixed. Children liked it, and adults were unsure what to do with it. It was too dark for a fairy tale, too whimsical for a thriller, too strange and uneven and tonally unpredictable to fit neatly into any category that made marketing departments comfortable. The film underperformed at the box office in 1971 and was quietly set aside. It found its audience not in theaters but on television, in the annual broadcasts that began in the late 1970s, where it accumulated, year by year, the generational mythology that would eventually make it iconic. And the scene that did that, the scene that lodged in the memories of every child who watched it from a living room floor and refused to leave, the scene that made Willy Wonka something more than a story about candy and imagination, was the scene nobody wanted Gene to put in the film. The scene where the warmth disappeared. The scene where Charlie learned that love does not come without conditions. The scene where Wonka said, with a cold and absolute fury that no amount of chocolate or golden tickets could soften, "You had one thing I asked of you, one thing, and you broke it, and now you get nothing." Every child who ever watched that scene felt something they could not yet name. Not fear exactly, not cruelty exactly. Something that felt in a way that no other scene in the film managed, entirely true. The world does not always reward goodness automatically. The people who love you most will sometimes be the ones who hold you to the hardest account. And the anger of a person who believed in you is not the same thing as the anger of a person who did not care. Gene Wilder knew all of this at 37 years old because he had been taught it before he had words for it. His mother's life had been the stakes. His laughter had been the instrument. His childhood had been the education. And when he stood on that set in Bavaria and looked across the desk at the boy playing Charlie Bucket and let the thing come through without softening it, what he was doing, what he was actually doing beneath the performance, beneath the script, beneath the character, was honoring the weight of it. Honoring the seriousness of what it means to be trusted with something precious and to treat it carelessly. That is what he told Johnny. And Johnny, who had spent 30 years being trusted with 22 million people's last hour of the night, and who understood, more intimately than anyone, what it meant to carry that weight without dropping it. Johnny understood completely. "Do you think the children watching knew?" Johnny asked at one point during that conversation, his voice quiet. Gene thought about it. "I think they felt it," Gene said. "Children feel things they cannot name. They felt that Wonka was not performing the anger, that it was real. And I think that was the first time many of them had ever seen an adult on a screen stop performing for a moment and let something real come through. And it frightened them a little, and it also made them feel in a way they could not explain, that the world was more serious and more honest than the movies usually admitted, that love was serious, that trust was serious, that when you break something that someone gave you in good faith, there are consequences that cannot be undone with a smile and an apology. He paused. I think that is why the scene stayed with people, Gene said. Not because it was frightening, because it was true. The studio was completely quiet. Not a cough. Not a shift. 300 people sitting in the particular quality of silence that descends when something has been said that everyone in the room has been waiting their entire lives to hear said plainly. And Johnny Carson looked at Gene Wilder across the desk of The Tonight Show and said, I have been doing this job for 20 years. And that is the most honest thing anyone has ever said on this stage. Jerome Silberman became Gene Wilder. Gene Wilder became Willy Wonka. Willy Wonka turned on a boy in a chocolate factory and let the anger be the anger for 90 seconds. And somewhere in that chain of transformations, a man who had spent his life calibrating joy found out what it felt like to release something uncalibrated, something real and raw and not made into anything. He found out it felt like putting down a weight he had not known he was carrying. He found out it felt like coming home.